Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2604 of The Tom Woods Show. We got with us Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And I don't even know where to begin talking to Ryan. But the guy writes an article every 28 seconds, so he's always got something interesting you can talk to him about. But he has one on secession, and these days, nowadays, certainly on the right wing, for the most part, the idea of secession is probably, let's say at a low ebb, because the feeling is we won and we're going to get our way, and we want the whole ball of wax, and so they're not thinking this way. But as Ryan said in the portion of this episode we didn't have the record button pressed for, we were just bantering, which was probably the best part. We should have just pressed record and started the bantering. But he said, we have to think about, I'm going to tell people what you said, Ryan. We have to think about the long term as well as the short term. So in the short term, if Trump wants to close down the Department of Education, we should support that. But we also need to think about not just what's going on in the next 24 hours, but what's going on in the next 24 years. Where is this ship ultimately heading? And so we do still need to think about big questions and not just the smaller questions of the day, which I do indeed talk about on this program. But it is important to keep our eye on the ball, the giant ball of important events and important big ideas. So Ryan, welcome back.
It's great to be with you, Tom.
All right, so talk to me about your article on secession. That seems like out of a bolt out of nowhere in the middle of all the congratulatory stuff. I say, by the way, the way the permanent bureaucracy has gotten whiplash by everything going on in Washington right now does have me happy, but it isn't the permanent solution. We need to think about all the way down the road. Why talk about secession now? What's the connection?
Well, even I'm not completely immune to the good feelings, right?
It is the era of good feelings, but different from the first one.
It's good to see, government agents of various types being humiliated, the various agents of the regime in a panic of things like that, and people just hating these new appointees that I think they're going to have to approve anyway. So I enjoy all of that. But I also know 2026 is right around the corner when Trump's probably going to lose his House majority. I also know that 2028 is coming fast. And what then, right? Trump can't be reelected. Who is going to replace him, and what does that mean for the longer term? And so what are we thinking about in terms of what is the United States going to be in 20 years? What's going to be in 10 years? And what can we do in the meantime to address the worst parts of the direction that we're heading, which I would still say overall probably not headed in the most ideal direction in terms of trends within the United States. And before the election, we already knew what was going to happen. We talked about this in editorial meetings at the Mises Institute. If Biden wins, we're going to hear a lot of people from Texas and conservatives and red state people talking about secession. If Biden loses and Trump wins, we all know California is going to talk about secession. So Trump wins, and lo and behold, we're hearing about secession out of the state of California. So no surprises there. But what is interesting is that it's a pretty continuing drumbeat really coming out of California, right? In terms of radical change. Not all of these things are in terms of California leaving entirely. Some of it is breaking up California into smaller pieces. Back in 2017, though, it was about leaving the United States. And then again, they're talking about that because what happened last week is that the Secretary of State approved a new ballot measure in California for Californians in 2026, I believe, to vote yes or no on the question of should California become an independent country. And of course, voting yes on it doesn't magically make the United States a sovereign, independent country. It starts this process of creating committees and investigations into, is this something we should do? So even if they were to vote yes on this, that's still just a beginning of a longer process. But just my general overall position on secession, whether it's California, whether it's other parts of the United States, is that if we look historically throughout the West, and of course, including America's experience as seceding from the British Empire, one of the best ways to really rein in state power and to decentralize state power is through acts of secession. And in my book, Breaking Away, right, I'm not content to talk about the Confederacy or 19th century America, right? Look at countless examples from the 19th and 20th century of this sort of thing, and it does rein in state power. So if we're going to be still worried about the power of the U.S. state 10, 20 years from now, and really probably 4 years from now, it's going to become a big worry again. Or probably 2 years from now. I mean, I don't know how long the honeymoon for Trump is going to last. But reality is going to set back in that we are living within the tax farm known as the United States, and that the government here wields vast power, and that something's going to have to be done about that. And so we do still need to talk about big, bold strategies that are trying to rein in this power.
Yeah, no kidding. And so I have a friend, Mikkel Thorup. He's an unbelievable expert on expat issues. He's visited an enormous number of countries, lived in like 9 of them. You know, he met his wife is from one country. They met at another country. They had each of their several children in different countries. He owns property in like 9 or 10 countries. His children are all polyglot. I mean, he's got such a fascinating story. And he advises people on questions of not just relocation, like he also does like international investment and real estate and stuff like that, but he does advise on international relocation. And on the eve of the election, I am sure he had a lot of inquiries coming in. But I think now some people are thinking, well, I don't know if I necessarily want to do that. Now, there are still people with wanderlust who still are adventurous enough that they are still thinking about potentially relocating. But I think it's not as popular as it would have been if a Joe Biden had won. But we have to remember that although Trump did, to my mind, unexpectedly win the popular vote as well as the Electoral College, it wasn't the kind of absolutely crushing defeat that, some people might have preferred. And so, I think we can't proceed as if all problems are solved. And I mean, I understand where people are coming from when they say the new golden age is here, but there's another part of our brains that has to stay alert for the future. And to think about what our options are, what we should be thinking about, what issues we should be raising, what long-term projects we should undertake. And a lot of that involves getting people to consider certain alternatives to be mainstream. Now, 10 years ago, abolishing the FBI or shutting down or even just reshuffling around United States Agency for International Development was not on the table, and now suddenly it is. So it's our job to get more and more and more of those things on the table, because remember, Ron Paul was literally laughed at, and I'm using the word literally in its literal sense. He was actually laughed at in the presidential debates when he listed various things he wanted to abolish. It was Chris Wallace who said to him, now you say you want to abolish all these things, and he's listing them in a way as to make Dr. Paul look ridiculous. But yet you get on that list today, and you can find a decent plurality of people who favor all of those things now. So our job is to keep on that Ron Paul revolution, pushing forward for things that seem impossible today, but there are a lot of things that are possible today that seemed impossible 10 years ago.
Well, and I would say really in a strange way, the Trump movement is something of the child of the Ron Paul movement. It was a realization that something was deeply wrong in the United States. They managed to neutralize Ron. And had Ron been elected, you can be sure that they would have thrown everything that they threw at Trump and then some, far worse at Ron, in terms of trying to make him out to be an agent of foreign powers and all of that sort of stuff. So we kind of now know what the strategy is if someone who is not an approved candidate from the other side is. They're not going to stop doing that. They're going to have 4 years to regroup. And the fact that, I mean, if you really should only get a free pass on all of this. Everything's fine now. You're only allowed to think that really if you're like under 25 years old. I don't know how you could have come through a few political cycles and still think, whatever's going on right now is going to be the same politically 4 years from now. I mean, 4 years is an eternity in terms of electoral fortune. So I would be insane to try and predict what's going to happen in 2028. But yeah, looking back at what has become almost mainstream since Ron Paul was doing his thing back in 2008, 2012, I mean, the criticism of the Fed, right? That's not even a weird thing to say anymore. Saying that the United States is going to maybe in the future break up into some smaller pieces. I think that is, while you'll still meet plenty of nationalists who hate that idea, that's becoming much more difficult to deny, because especially after the COVID experience, where suddenly people realize that the state you live in makes a big difference. And you had, I think, really for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, I mean, there may have been certain things like this in the 19th century, but people used to talk when I was younger about, oh, the taxes are too high in state XYZ, and I'm going to move to this other state. That never seemed to actually happen. Nobody really moved to get a slightly lower tax rate or some different government regulation. But during COVID, that seems to have become fairly common.
Yeah.
And so there's a realization now, I think, that where you live matters. And back to that issue of leaving, right? Thinking about moving away. That brings us very much to the benefits of secession and how people need to be thinking about that in terms of the future. If you really do think that the answer to bad problems in our political system is to relocate, then you should be absolutely in favor of secession, because that gives you more choices. Even if the United States were just to break up into two pieces, rather than having to learn a new language or move across the ocean or go to a very different place in terms of culture and all those other things that we consider just the regular amenities of daily life. If you had country A east of the Mississippi and country B west of the Mississippi, now you suddenly have two choices of places to go where you would fit in pretty well, but which have a true choice in political system. And so if people are saying that relocating is the answer to a political problem, then they're essentially endorsing in a certain way the idea of secession, because they can see that being able to move to another place is a way to improve your political fortunes and your freedom. And so that's just always something to keep in mind, that secession is about choice, and it's about creating other places that we could live and move and enjoy life. And if the world were all just one country, you would have no choices at all. And the more countries there are, the more choices you have. And so choice is good. And that's just the basic framework when we're talking about secession. And so that's just the larger issue we need to think about going into the medium and longer term.
My friends, we're all on the spectrum, the risk spectrum, that is. Some of us play it safe, while others are ready to bet half their income on red on a Las Vegas roulette wheel. But I am willing to take some risks in exchange for being able to live on my own terms. For still others, even the prospect of not receiving a regular paycheck from an employer is too much to bear. There's no right or wrong here. It's a matter of what you're comfortable with. And that's why the franchise option can be a happy medium between the extremes. Yes, you're going out on your own, but you're not entirely on your own. With a franchise, you've got existing branding, existing products and services, and existing formulas all ready to go for you. A friend I know from the libertarian world has set up a system that you can use to narrow down all the franchise possibilities out there to one that will work best for you, given your goals and interests. He's just published a free guide to franchising that is well worth the read. Get your free copy at tomwoods.com/franchise. It seems to me there are two things that could happen here. I mean, there are two likely outcomes. One is that the right wing, let's say, and if we want to call the Trump movement roughly that, consolidates its gains. It generates some decent results for the country, such that people on the fence start to lean a little bit more Trump, and it more or less survives the usual bloodbath of the midterm elections, and then continues to have success into 2028 and beyond, and becomes and the left gradually becomes routed. But the other, I don't know, maybe equally likely possibility is that it's a pendulum that is just going to keep going back and forth. And that when the other side gets back in power, they are going to unleash heaven knows what on their opponents, and then the opponents get back in, and there's no stable equilibrium here. It's a pendulum shift back and forth. And then you have to decide, is that really the best conceivable way that we could live? Is that the best way? Is being on a wildly swinging pendulum all the time? Or might it not be better to figure out some other way of sorting ourselves so that most of the time I at least, no one's going to be perfect, but at least I have some stability. I have some expectation of what's likely coming down the road, and I don't have to adjust my life every 4 years to like an alien regime in power.
Well, and I fear even that the pendulum swings are going to become greater and more extreme over time. If you look at the way Trump is governing, and like lots of people, I'm delighted at the content of many of these executive orders. But if you are really entering into a situation, and it's not just Trump, right? It's become progressively worse over the last several presidencies. This idea of, hey, what was it that Obama said? Something about how, hey, it's great. You got a pen and a phone, and you can just enact new laws with executive orders. You don't really have to do anything. You don't need all this debate in Congress sort of stuff. What a pain in the butt that is. And so now we've got essentially rule by executive order, a form of rule by decree. And yes, Trump's undoing a lot of bad executive orders that the last guy did. Okay, well, what if Trump-type people lose next time? Is it just going to then be, what hundreds of executive orders are going to come down then in the first month of that presidency? Right. I don't want to find out.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of the executive orders deal with federal employees, and he can order them to do, what he wants them to do. But other things like abolishing the Department of Education, which is unconstitutional anyway. So if you're looking at it from a constitutional standpoint, it doesn't really matter, in my opinion, how you go about that, because it shouldn't be there in the first place. But if he were to direct, because he can direct the heads of these departments, if he were to direct the head of that department to just close it down, can he do that without congressional authorization? I mean, I don't even care, because in this case, he's undoing something that's unconstitutional. But I wonder if within that range of what is allowed to the president, if that's included. But the other thing is, the way I see it, the left does not need the precedent of Trump's executive orders. Like, it's not saying, well, we'd love to exercise power in a particular way, but we'll only do it if we are sticking with a recent precedent. They'll do whatever they want to do. So I've gotten to the point where that's not an argument I even use with them. Like if you let Trump get away with, or if you let Biden get away with this, then Trump will do it to you. They just want to exercise power, and they'll roll the dice and take their chances.
Yeah, I think it's just become a longer term trend. A lot of it comes back to how Congress behaves right now, because Congress is now with all this omnibus bill stuff. We pass a couple of pieces of legislation a year. There are these huge multi-thousand page bills. Nobody knows what's in them. There isn't any real debate in Congress. Congress essentially gives its own power out to the technocracy, and the whole system is so dysfunctional. I mean, that's part of the reason why I can't believe why anybody would think that we should really just plan for the long haul and start speaking well about being part of the United States. And I really kind of, I can only sigh when people come and they say, yes, I admit that the government is in need of some reform, but we can't just go talking about breaking up the United States. That would be madness. We just need some reform. Well, how many decades have people been saying that? And has it ever resulted in any significant reining in of the federal government? I mean, Trump may provide a slowdown in that sort of thing for the next 4 years, but we're not going to wake up. In spite of everything Doge wants to do, Doge could cut $2.5 trillion and we'd still be in deficit territory and adding to the national debt, barreling toward $40 trillion. You need major structural changes in order to keep this ship from running aground in terms of things like sovereign debt crises and major legitimacy problems of the nature that the Soviet Union encountered as it slowly went bankrupt. And if we just pretend that could never happen, then we're about as insightful as the people who told us in 1989 that the Soviet Union would be with us for many generations to come. And that just seems to be what everybody assumes, is that whatever's happening right now will be happening 50 years from now. But just look at any political map of the world a mere 100 years ago, and you will see just how temporary political institutions are. So we should be thinking in broader terms about how to address issues like the debt and the dollar, and how little those things are going to change in the next few years, and really how does that sort of thing get addressed. But of course, people's eyes glaze over when you start to talk about how the debt affects inflation and affects them on a daily basis. That takes 20 minutes to explain. And so you're fighting a losing battle a lot of the time trying to focus on that stuff.
It's that political institutions are almost immune to reform. And I mean, there are reasons that should be the case. And so an analogy is, a lot of people these days are talking about foreign aid. Now, some foreign aid is, or probably most of it, has political strings, and there's a self-interested reason behind it. But other foreign aid is portrayed, at least, as being humanitarian and to help other countries. But the problem with so-called development aid is that its track record is terrible. And Peter Bauer in the early 1970s and onward tried to explain all the damage that international development aid actually does to societies. And he ended up winning a major prize. I think he was, I don't know what, he was given some honor in the UK by Margaret Thatcher. I mean, he was really, really right on the money about that. So what some advocates of development aid started to say was, well, it's not like Peter Bauer doesn't have a point, but the issue is we just need to direct the aid a little bit more precisely toward worthier projects. So they're not really listening to what he was saying, but we just need to direct it a little bit more precisely. Well, now this U.S. aid Agency for International Development is under fire. And you got people saying, yeah, look, of course you can dig up some problems with where the money is going, but we just need to pinpoint that even better. So 50 years later, we're still having this conversation. Close to 50 to 60. We're still having this conversation about, well, we just need to reform it a little bit more. If we're still having this conversation, it can't be done. It isn't going to happen. So figure out some other way to accomplish this goal, especially when I have no reason to doubt that statistic that only 10% of the money ever goes to anything worthwhile anyway, ever, in these sorts of programs. You can't reproduce 10% of that budget in the private sector. Get out of here.
Well, you need major structural and ideological change in order for any of this stuff to change. And I don't think that really anything has changed in the views of ordinary people until recently. I think people are really starting to feel the effects of the inflation. Younger people, man, like looking out for my kids, my older kids, in terms of affordability of homes, in terms of the stories I hear about looking for a job for young 20-somethings are like nightmare stories. And these things are not easy by any means. And I think only the people who are deeply out of touch with, especially younger people, are thinking that everything is still just fine. And if we can just tweak it a little bit, then the American dream will come back. That seems to be becoming more and more distant in terms of a viable reality for a lot of people. And so when I look at that, I just think I'm not interested in minor tweaks. I'm not interested in tiny little changes around the margins, or just doing what we've been doing for the last 50 years in terms of saying we can trim a little here or do a little bit of reform there. Because what are those signs really are of a society and a political institutions in decline, where we're always constantly talking about the need for reform, but nothing changes. And what happens then is if you don't have some sort of structural or ideological change that forces these change on the central system, then they just continue down to oblivion. They will always support the people who are friends of the regime and who are doing well. Those people will continue to go well, but you really do start to get into territory. And I'm not one of these alarmists who's been saying for the last 40 years that the middle class is disappearing. But when I do look at the realities since COVID, I do see realities in terms of affordability and just living a normal life becoming more and more difficult. And it can continue in this way without people searching out major radical changes. And I don't want those radical changes to be, hey, capitalism failed. We need more socialism. We just need a stronger government to force through all the things that need to be done. Whereas the experience of the West, and you mentioned Peter Bauer. Bauer's done a lot of good historical work on what were the institutions in the West that helped it be free. And a lot of that was the fact that the West was so decentralized in terms of there were so many different states. There was no continent-wide power that was able to force any one system to just keep limping along year after year. People had choices. People were able to go to other places, and that made a huge, huge difference. But now we're just being told the status quo is fine. We'll just make some minor changes and don't talk about any of that radical stuff. That's just too much. That's just asking for trouble, is to just be complacent about whatever our problems are. We'll get around to reforming those eventually. But I'm not willing to sign off on anything that might upset a large number of people. But that seems to be at least where the people who are in charge of things happen to be right now. And I think just the more radical people who want some changes are finally just starting, I think, to get some voice in this.
Hey everybody, your old friend Woods here is about to save you a bundle. I'd like to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer, who are changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our businesses, but the best business software doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their typical software bill. It gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business and without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what is wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. You can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of the Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. Go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big favor. Check them out. So I think the point that you and I are more or less trying to make here is that just because Trump won doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to push the Overton window farther and farther and farther, more and more and more, and allow a ever wider range of discussion of possibilities.
Rothbard talked about how our goal should be to emulate the tactics of the abolitionists. That is the anti-slavery abolitionists, because he looked at them and they saw, okay, what was their functioning method? What was the method they employed politically? And at least before the war, right? Once the war happened, they kind of abandoned their earlier principles because they saw victory was in their sights through coercion. But before the war, the idea was we will accept any change that moves things in our direction towards abolition. So you want to just outlaw slavery in this one place? Fine, we'll take it. But we're not going to stop pushing for the ultimate goal, which is total abolition. And so that needs to be our goal always. Oh, you want to cut taxes? Great, we'll take it. But we're not going to suddenly say, everything's fine now. We're now okay. We now endorse the system. And the left has always been good about this, right? Think Obamacare, right? We want more and more government control of the healthcare system. Great. And they got Obamacare finally after pushing for more and more government control year after year. What did they do 5 minutes after Obamacare was passed? Well, now we need Medicare for all. Now we need a single payer healthcare system. Yeah, we got Obamacare, but that's not enough coverage. We need even more. So they never give up. They always keep pushing over and over again. But what I see from a lot of Trump supporters is that, we won this election, time to rest, time to just declare victory and not push for anything more. And I don't know what it is about the right that is just people are wanting to take a rest all the time, whereas the left thinks they can never stop. I mean, there may be sinister reasons for that, but that's just a recipe for failure. And you have to appreciate the other side is always pushing against you. So if you're just going to kind of rest and call it a day, you're just going to move in the wrong direction then, because the other side is going to be working full time against you.
I think one problem that, again, for lack of a better term, the right used to have, but that I think they're getting a little bit better on, is they used to be the kind of people who, unlike the left, would more or less be satisfied by somebody who gives a pretty speech. Oh, I heard that guy's speech. He's really on our side. And then he turns around and stabs you in the back at every possible opportunity, but he gave that great speech, and that's all they remember. Whereas the left will make your life miserable until you do what they say. Until like they actually do. When we talk about, that we voted in this questionable guy, but we're going to hold him accountable, whatever that means, and it never happens. You have to at least hand it to the left. They actually try to hold people accountable. And I hate to bring this into, I don't really hate to, I actually kind of like bringing it in, the analogy to the Catholic Church. That is very, very true for a lot of people in the church, that people would listen, they'd hear the local bishop would give some conference, and he would talk all about the rosary and all about abortion, and people would walk away saying, wow, that is a great bishop. And meanwhile, at every opportunity, he's making your parish worse. He's kicking out the good people and installing terrible people, and he's winking at all the bad people and persecuting all the good ones. But he gave that nice speech that time, and whereas the left isn't that way. It's words are not enough for them. They want action, and that is one thing that non-leftists could stand to learn.
Well, and I'm sure you get that all the time, right? If you and me, we have no problem with praising Trump when he does something good, right?
Absolutely not.
I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't think this guy's worse than anybody else. I don't even think tariffs are worse than other types of taxes necessarily, but they are a tax, and so I'm going to point that out. But what you get all the time from the people who have decided that Trump made nice speeches and they like him now and he's their guy is if you do criticize something specific that he does that you think is bad, you will get emails all day long about cut this guy some slack. Now is the time to give him some time to do what he's going to do. And stop judging him. Quit trying to black pill everybody. Whereas all we're trying to do is hold these governmental institutions to a higher standard and demand that they do stuff that we think is pro-freedom. But it's so bizarre to get constant messages from people who say, well, I'm pro-freedom, but I think we just need to kind of sit back and let government do its thing, which that just seems to me a terrible idea.
Well, also, I think there have been some good Trump appointments, but, since I don't think opportunities like this happen a lot, where somebody outside the Romney, McCain, McConnell axis gets elected president, I don't know how many other opportunities there are going to be. You better believe I'm going to complain if there are bad appointments. It's the only chance there is. According to like what everybody says, this is the most amazing political comeback story in the history of the world. That means it's rare. Okay, that means it's a rare occurrence. So I just want to make sure that during this rare occurrence, the most is made out of it. That's all.
I mean, it just seems like you're telling people, don't write letters to your congressman. Let him do his thing.
Yeah, right.
He's trying hard. But what? I'm not supposed to express my opinion and say, hey, I don't think you're doing a good enough job. Do better. How is that a bad thing when we're talking politics? This whole trust the system thing just strikes me as bizarre. But I mean, so many people behave that way. Whenever their guy is in charge, well, it's exactly like the bishop thing. He's, he said some good things. He's my guy. And
right,
so I'm sure
I met him at the spaghetti supper,
right.
At the Masonic Lodge. I know he's a good guy.
I met him once and he was very polite and a very self-effacing, nice man. So he must be doing a great job. This is entirely the wrong attitude towards people who are in positions of power.
I remember back when I was a professor, we had Senator Chuck Schumer come give the graduation speech at the college. Well, when I say we had him come, I assure you, Ryan, I had nothing to do with it. No one consulted me. But if they had, we would have had a much more interesting speaker. But so Schumer gets up there and gives what I have to say If you've ever heard, it never changes, by the way. He gave the speech the next year, he came back, and it was word for word the same speech. So he's done this speech 125 times. And it is delivered flawlessly. It is entertaining, funny, absorbing, interesting, charming. It makes you instantly like him. Now, it didn't make me like him, but I could imagine somebody who knows nothing listening to that and thinking, that guy's he's like me. That guy's just like me. And I don't know what the point of the story is, but I had to tell you that I sat through it more than once. And I remember thinking the second time, is he going to say anything different? No, it's the same graduation speech he gives that in a very subtle way puffs himself up, but you could almost miss it. It's just subtle enough to be manipulative. Like it's brilliantly done. That if you have a chance to see him give that graduation speech, it's a masterclass in how to manipulate an audience while appearing to flatter and praise them, because after all, we're celebrating their graduation. The way these people, these people who are like part of the permanent state they didn't get there by accident. They are good. They are good at persuasion. And therefore they are good at reaching people who otherwise would never ever read the text of a Chuck Schumer speech. They would never listen to him being interviewed on television, but they walk out of that event saying, I heard that great speech from that guy. And so we have our work cut out for us, because we have to say, well, look, I don't have a cute story like he did, and I'm not as polished as he is, but he's a crook and he's stealing from you. You know, like we have a bit of an uphill battle after he goes on the charm offensive with total strangers.
Well, that's one of our mottos here at the Mises Institute is we learn economics to learn how we're being ripped off.
Yes.
Because it's hard to know otherwise. But once you've found out the many subtle ways you were being ripped off by the central bank, by the way the federal government spends money, all of that, then you don't forget. And then you can see past the pretty speeches and that sort of thing, as you were doing with the Schumer talk, even though, and heck, I remember hearing Bill Clinton's speeches back in the 90s where I wasn't quite convinced, but I remember thinking, man, this guy, maybe he's not so bad. But then I would come back to my senses after a little while, but good speaker, no doubt. I felt like he felt my pain, right? And so we do have to be able to look beyond that, but we've got to be explaining things that people feel don't apply to them. And I think that brings us back to the issue of, because this is a question I often get whenever I'm talking about the secession issue or any sort of radical change. They're like, why would people want this? Like, people seem pretty happy. Or what needs to happen in order for any of these radical changes to take place? And I do think that until you get to the point where people start to feel that the system isn't working for them, that a large number of the people realize that they are being ripped off, which they are being ripped off, but I don't think a critical number of people understand it yet, or that they're being ripped off on purpose. That once you get to that point, that's when you get your radical changes. I mean, you look at the last 15 years of the Soviet Union, and you look at how those people regarded their government. Yeah, there was always that plurality, 30, 40% of the population, and it gets smaller over time. But those people were still solid defenders of the regime, no matter what. But over time, you got 30, 40, 50, eventually maybe even 60% of the population realize, hey, I'm just getting poorer and poorer. The people in charge seem fine. This system isn't working. What can we do to change it? And I don't think Americans are at that point yet. I could explain to people how the $3 trillion debt deficit that we're going to have this year and the $40 trillion debt that's coming is going to make them poorer. It is going to make it impossible for the children to afford a house in many cases. It is going to make the prices of groceries go up. Their standard of living is going to decline. But I don't think we're far enough down that road yet for people to see exactly how our system is ripping them off so badly. And so until that happens, things like secession or other radical changes are going to seem like just very far off and something nobody has any appetite for. And I mean, we need historical events to some extent to help us out, right? Ideology needs to both be, it needs to be reflected in reality, and it needs to be backed up by reality. And now the ideology that we call libertarianism historically comes out of historical experience. It's based on historical realities. But when you have people who are pretty happy with things, they're not seeing its relevance. They're not seeing how it helps them out. And so we're kind of waiting for people to really come to that realization. And I just don't think we're there right now.
Well, I was thinking as I sat here that maybe I'm a little bit too black-pilled on. I'm not. Why am I saying this? But I think I'm exactly the right amount black-pilled. I got some white pill in me. I got some black pill in me. But I was going to say that Ron Paul's a bit of an exception to the rule that I mentioned because he doesn't have a memorized, rehearsed, polished speech that he gives at college graduations. He just speaks extemporaneously, and he's very clearly not polished. He's not trying to be. Like he's not measuring every phrase according to what a focus group tells him. He's just a guy who's smart, who knows a lot, and he's trying to convey that to people. And that there's a whole slew of people he will not connect with. But on the other hand, he obviously did connect with a lot of people because today, I bet we couldn't even name half the people who were on the debate stage in 2008, 2007 with him in the GOP. I mean, Duncan Hunter, is anybody still... I don't even know if he's still alive. Maybe he's dead. I don't even know. Tommy Thompson, is anybody following these people? But
Dude,
yet
Gary
today,
Bauer.
You got Elon Musk basically saying Ron Paul was right. So sometimes you can get just the flat out information. I am not here to flatter you or make you think I'm a cool guy. Man, Ron Paul never even uses the word I. Like I, as your president, will blah, blah, blah. He never talked like that. It was more, look, this is a situation we're facing and you need to know what's going on. And there were at least enough people for that now we get to this point and there's been enough time for those ideas to percolate that maybe some people will actually listen. And that happened without the polished speeches and the crowd pleasing one-liners or anything like that. So, for what that's worth, that's at least the remnant at work.
Well, and another place to be white-pilled is on foreign policy. Well, relatively. It's not like that problem's been solved. But you remember 2003, 2004, all the government had to do was say, these people on the other side of the planet, they're bad. We should send your sons and brothers and your children to go fight in this war, even though you don't even know what the purpose of the war is. Oh, it has something to do with 9/11. Just trust us and give up your children to us. And people just rolled over and said, no problem. And I started to see that, okay, maybe people have actually learned something when Obama started talking about how we need boots on the ground in Syria and we need to invade there. And there was no enthusiasm. And on this Ukraine thing, no enthusiasm. Yeah, people have accepted all sorts of bad stuff like all the aid, all that money flushed down the toilet to various criminals in Ukraine and such. And lots of insane talk about how nuclear war is not that big a deal. But that's pretty much all just like the media class and your upper class people. Normal people seem to have really come to their senses on a lot of foreign policy issues. So yet again, Ron, I think, made some real strides there. But again, that we can't sit back and say, yep, the golden age has begun. We don't need to do anything anymore. And we don't need any sort of escape strategies going forward.
Well, you definitely need an escape plan of some kind. I mean, you'd be out of your mind not to have that. So go and watch tomwoods.com/plan B. It doesn't cost anything. Just watch it. tomwoods.com/plan B. Jot that down in the car. Everybody needs a plan B. But in particular, another thing that's kind of heartening along these lines and relating to foreign policy. Earlier this week in my email newsletter, which you should all be getting, you can get it. You can also get a free book while you're at it, free ebook, tomsfreebooks.com. Pick out any book you want, pick all of them if you want, and you get my email newsletter, which is indispensable. So tomsfreebooks.com. Everybody listening to that, to what I'm saying right now, should go to tomsfreebooks.com and do that. So on my email newsletter, one of the issues this week, I talked about Bill Kristol. Now, we all know Bill Kristol. He co-founded the Project for a New American Century, which is the big neocon interventionist racket. I believe he was chief of staff for Vice President Quayle a long time ago. He was the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard until it folded. And he's been a constant commentator on cable news channels. And I am certain that Bill Kristol expected to live out his life as he had lived it over the past few decades, where he's welcomed and feted in Washington circles and invited to all the influential parties. And he's never made any real connection with real Americans. But the DC circuit seems to like him, and the TV shows seem to like him, even though he's politics' answer to Jim Cramer. He's wrong on everything. Every prediction is wrong. But he never saw a war he didn't like. And suddenly, this is all going away right before his eyes. First mistake of many was that he agreed several years ago to debate Scott Horton in person on the subject of the wisdom of regime change as a foreign policy device. And he debated this in New York City. It was recorded. You can find it on YouTube. Scott Horton versus Bill Kristol, Kristol. And Bill Kristol had his head handed to him. It was an embarrassment. And it goes to show, first of all, that these people who are part of the regime in one way or another are very unimpressive. They live in a bubble, and they cannot function outside that bubble. You know, Bill Kristol is used to debating people who accept 85% of his premise. Well, Scott Horton accepts 0 of it, and Kristol was absolutely unprepared. So that was the first thing. Now, also, another thing. He used to be welcomed at the Heritage Foundation. But this very week, the Heritage Foundation mocked him on Twitter/X because he was talking about how the deep state is better than the Trump state. And the Heritage Foundation made fun of him. They said, first it was there is no deep state. Then, there is a deep state, but so what? Then it was there's a deep state and that's a good thing. And then it's there's a deep state and if you're against it, you're the problem. And they quoted Bill Kristol. So he's being mocked by the very institutions that not 10 years ago used to welcome him to their events. Then Elon Musk, one of the greatest, certainly best known people in the world, on Twitter responded to some people pointing out that indirectly, one of Bill Kristol's democracy rackets was indirectly funded by USAID. Very indirect, but there's a connection. And Elon just simply wrote, not anymore. Now, Bill did not expect his life to take that turn, but take that turn, it absolutely has. And you're darn right I'm going to pause to celebrate that.
Yeah, and I think there are many things that we can think are good. And also, you can have that. I'm not a person who wants the world to get worse all the time.
Right.
In the hopes that my radical solutions will become more viable.
That's
right. I have 4 children. I'm not going to tell them, well, kids, I'm doing all I can to sabotage the system so that it's an absolute hellscape for you. But then something good might happen 10 years from now, kids, so I'm sure you'll be fine. No, I'm absolutely in favor of reforms that can improve things. But I also know that, first of all, that large states breaking up into smaller pieces is inevitable. It is going to happen. You can say, no, America's going to be here 1,000 years from now. All you want. The odds of that happening are about 0. Okay, this just isn't how states function because demographics change. You have new power centers arise and countries break up into smaller pieces. It happens everywhere with every large state that we can see. The most recent example of which is just the Soviet Union, which, by the way, was ruled by a totalitarian regime that could simply murder anybody who wanted to break off and do their own thing. And even that wasn't enough to hold it together. Just like prisons have riots, right? That's never enough. And so, yeah, it's inevitable. I can guarantee you the United States is going to break up into smaller pieces, and that 100 years, 50 years in political time is a very long time. So what we need to be focusing on is, we don't need to badmouth every reform that makes things look a little bit better, but why should we be satisfied with things just not being as bad as they could be, when, of course, we could be exploring options that would, in fact, make the world a more free and wonderful place by making some larger changes, and all the while just making sure that we speak the truth, that we help people become better informed so that if you do reach a crisis situation, people don't conclude that socialism instead of freedom is the solution to everything, because you can be sure that as soon as the economy makes its next downward turn, that you're going to be told that what caused your woes, everybody, is capitalism. There was too much capitalism, and that's why there's a recession now. They do that every time, which is why we're always trying to explain why that's not the solution. And I do think, I mean, even it's not even going to take that much to get people thinking in terms of major changes again. All you need is your unemployment rate to go up to 10%. Suddenly people realize that things aren't working as well as they thought real quick. It doesn't even need to be some sort of major Weimar Republic sort of situation. It just needs to be, I'm unemployed now and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills. Suddenly the political system looks a lot less attractive. So these are the things that we're trying to prepare for, and we're trying to explain how institutional changes actually help freedom in the longer run. And one of those institutional changes is radical decentralization through one form or another, one of which is secession. But if you want to explore other ways of radically decentralizing the U.S. government's power, that's fantastic. I'm open to all that stuff too. De facto secession, where you're still part of the United States in name only, fine. All that stuff's great. But just continuing what we're doing, it's not going to lead to everything just being fine.
All right. And with that, thank you, Ryan McMaken from the Mises Institute, Mises.org, MISES.org. I'm going to be speaking at a Mises Institute event at the end of April. I think it's April 26th. Maybe I should check that before I tell people. It's, well, I know that it can't be, well, you know, I'm just going to look. But it's an event that has Tom DiLorenzo as well as Dr. Robert Malone. It's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona. And let's see, I'm
it
just
is
about
the 26th.
April 26th. I was right.
Yeah,
April 26th. So you can find that out find out about that at Mises.org/events. And if you can get $15 off the registration if you use my coupon code, which is Woods25. So like Woods in the year 2025. So Woods25 at Mises.org/events. Find the Phoenix event, and it'll take $15 off your registration. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But thanks so much again, Ryan. Always appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.